More heartbreak and devastation in Gaza. An Israeli airstrike on a school being used as a shelter kills at least 17 people, mostly women and children. This as the United States says ceasefire talks will resume this weekend. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidoo and this is The Heat. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says U.S. and Israeli negotiators are expected to restart negotiations on Sunday in Qatar in an attempt to reach a ceasefire in Gaza, release the remaining hostages and find a diplomatic solution for Lebanon. Blinken made the announcement from Doha on Thursday after meeting earlier this week with leaders in Israel and Saudi Arabia. In Gaza, several children are among the injured and dead after Israel Defense Forces hit a school sheltering displaced Palestinians. The IDF says the school was being used by Hamas as a command center. Overnight, Israel pounded residential areas in Beirut, destroying at least 6 buildings and starting widespread fires. Israel said it targeted buildings Hezbollah used to manufacture and store weapons. In Paris, donors pledged $1 billion to help Lebanon with humanitarian and military aid at an international conference. Over 1 million people have been forced to flee their homes. I spoke with Amin Salam, the Lebanese Minister of Economy and Trade, who's here in Washington, D.C. for the IMF World Bank meetings, about what his country is facing.
It's a dire situation. It's a catastrophic situation in all the country, particularly most recently in the city Beirut. We're talking as well about over 1,200,000 displaced people on top of the 2,500 killed. We are pushing diplomatically and politically for an immediate ceasefire because the destruction is massive, and we know that Lebanon was passing through a hard economic time before the war started. So between that and between the war, the country is in a very difficult, challenging spot now. The only solution is an immediate ceasefire to avoid further escalation and destruction in the country.
Can you give us an idea of what day-to-day life is like in a city like Beirut? I mean, what about things like businesses? Are they open? Schools, hospitals?
Well, I can assure you that since the war started about a year ago, most of our viable sectors, including tourism, including agriculture, production of agricultural products, those were the 2 big sectors in Lebanon that were driving still the economy, having people visit, having people bring in some cash to the country. Those 2 sectors were completely affected, were completely shut down, if you want to say in better terms, and that now kept Lebanon without any specific viable sector, creating jobs, creating income, turning around the money in the country. So on top of that, you have all the displaced people that are in the city now. Within less than a week, you have 1 million people moved from the south, the Bekaa, to the capital. So a lot of the businesses now are hesitant to open. They are scared of violence. They are scared of civil war issues. So many businesses, the private sector is in a very bad place today. The businesses, the economic cycle, you can feel it's under a lot of tension, and a lot are thinking now that they want to move out of Lebanon. Even the ones that are Lebanese companies, they feel that this is going to take time and that's going to affect all their future plans.
And as you say, the private sector is in a bad place right now. Do people have access to the essentials, things like food, water, medicines?
Well, thank God that is something us as a government, because we've been working on an emergency basis for the past 3 years. So we kind of put good plans in place before the war started by keeping all the food security front very safe. Like, we have everything needed for people to have their day-to-day food needs, all the necessities they need is all available. The biggest fear is that we have a siege on the airport or a siege on the port of Beirut where all the goods come. That is the biggest concern. But everything at this point is available for at least 4-month reserves in the country.
And you say 1.2 million people have been displaced. They're on the move. How are they being accommodated and what can you tell us about their fate?
So the government put a big emergency plan where we have over 1,000 shelters now for people that moved from those areas. But we have a big mix with the Lebanese people displaced. We have over 500,000 Syrian refugees as well that are living as well in a very difficult circumstances, because most of them are scattered all over the city and most of them are not in shelter homes. But the shelter homes that have been used are mostly schools, and that is creating a big concern as well, as far as the educational system is being drawn down due to filling all the schools with displaced people.
Your government says it needs substantial humanitarian assistance to help those displaced people, to help others who've been affected by the violence as well. The Environment Minister, Nasser Yassin, says Lebanon will need $250 million a month to cover basic food, water, sanitation and educational services. What kind of response are you getting from the international community? I mean, you're here now at the IMF.
It's been very, very, very shy so far. It's been very weak. I mean, the numbers that my colleague, the minister, have shared are, yes, on a monthly basis. And it's a big number to be able to cater to the emergency situation. So far, we have not received more than 10% or 15% of what we need to really be able to cover all the emergency plan and have people really live in a good shelter, have all their needs, have all their food. So now we're not even near 10% of that. That's why we're pledging, we have on the 24th a big meeting in France to get all the donor countries to sit down and see what they want to do to support Lebanon.
What are your expectations from that meeting?
I think, I mean, my expectations are not very positive, because I think there will be a lot of negotiation on behalf of the aid. It's going to be politically driven. I mean, it's very clear that a lot of the aid to Lebanon recently has been politically driven. So I think there's going to be requests from Lebanon, political requests from Lebanon to comply with, and then the aid will add up, and then we will have better aid if those conditions are met. It's not going to be a pure humanitarian approach. That's my feel.
But when you say political requests, are you saying that the aid's going to be conditioned on Lebanon doing things?
Unfortunately, yes. Despite the fact that we always believe that humanitarian aid is humanitarian aid, it should be always without any terms or any conditions. But I think in Lebanon's case, it's going to be very conditional. It's going to be politically driven for the country, for the government to take certain decisions, to comply with certain international decisions, including 1701 and all the other international decisions that we need to meet.
Now, Lebanon has been in the grip of a financial crisis that's since 2019. The World Bank estimates that poverty has tripled over the past decade, and it's affecting something like 44% of the population. How much worse is this conflict going to make that?
Well, from day one, I said that the more escalation we have, the longer this war takes to be finalized, the deeper we're taking Lebanon into the unknown. Because basically now we can say that the economy is not moving at all. And whatever sectors we have that were still driving the country, putting food on the table for people, are completely stagnant now. So any escalation, any targeting of the infrastructure or whatever is remaining of the infrastructure in Lebanon will be devastating on the country. It will literally take the country into the unknown.
As I said earlier, Lebanon has faced many, many challenges over the past few years. One of the worst was the aftermath of that catastrophic port explosion that took place. It was an explosion that really wrecked large parts of Beirut, affected infrastructure, affected businesses, affected housing. Where are you now in terms of recovery?
Well, we didn't even get to a place where we recovered, and then another chaos hits the country. That's why when they ask me about the economy, I tell them this economy has been going through one turbulence after the other, one turbulence after the other. And this war was the last, heavy turbulence coming to add a layer of disparity to the country, and it couldn't get worse. I mean, what we are going through now I think we couldn't take Lebanon to a worse place. That's why I'm saying it's very critical now that many of the friendly countries to Lebanon need to support Lebanon and not let this country turn into a completely failed state, because it's going to affect all the region, and the region is going to lose a very interesting mosaic in that part of the world.
You mentioned the diplomatic efforts that are being made by Lebanon to try and resolve this crisis. The United States is calling for the enforcement of a UN Security Council resolution, which was adopted actually at the end of the last war between Hezbollah and Israel. That was in 2006. It calls for Hezbollah to withdraw its fighters to the north of Lebanon's Litani River and for Israel to withdraw all its troops from Lebanese territory. Is that still a viable solution?
I think given the recent developments, given the scale of aggression and destruction that we have seen throughout this war, starting with Gaza, going to Lebanon, but particularly against Lebanon, I think the 1701 needs to have we need to have another look at 1701. I think it needs serious updating, or it needs serious work, because I don't think with what's happening now, a lot of the articles of 1701 are still mean anything, because 1701 was based on mostly, as you mentioned, like to have Hezbollah move to the Litani but that is not the issue now, and it will not be resolved this way. Yeah. So we will definitely need to do a big adjustment to 1701, but stick to the core approach of 1701 for a resolution.
Right, these adjustments that you talk about, these updates that you talk about to that resolution, what would you like to see in it?
Well, I would like to see more security on the side of Lebanon, because there are major fears of Lebanon that the Israeli side is not only seeking to push Hezbollah. There are fears of Lebanon that Israel is really looking at the Litani because they want the water of Lebanon. They want the seafront of Lebanon in Nakura to make their Karish oil production spot safe, and other things, so demographical interests that they have. But water is one of the major things from the Litani, because Lebanon is one of the few countries in the region that still has major water resources. So we want a 1701 that can really protect the land of Lebanon, the resources of Lebanon, mostly the resources, that we will be able to lift the country back through those resources.
Minister, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Pleasure.
Well, for more now on the Middle East conflict, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from London, Yosi Melber is a senior consulting fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House in London. Also with us, Nabeel Khoury is a former US diplomat and currently a non-resident senior fellow with the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. And Trita Parsi is the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. Great to have all of you. Thanks so much for being with us. Trita Parsi, the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he is back in the Gulf on another diplomatic mission to try and secure some kind of ceasefire to get the hostages released. He's been holding talks with representatives from Saudi Arabia, from Israel, with intermediaries in Qatar as well. Now, these talks have been stalled since August, and since then, we've seen the news. Thousands more Palestinians have been killed. What are his chances this time around?
I think we have to leave alone this mythology that the Biden administration is trying to secure a ceasefire, that it is trying to secure the release of the hostages. If that was the case, that they would have put pressure on the Netanyahu government to take the deal that they had negotiated, that was on the table, that could have and would have resolved most of these issues. But they chose not to. Instead, they followed what the Netanyahu government wanted to do. I fear that what they are mostly focused on right now is plans on how to deal with Gaza and a potential normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia after the war, rather than necessarily focusing on truly de-escalating the situation. De-escalating the situation would require pressure from the United States on the Netanyahu government. 2 weeks, 10 days, whatever it is before the US elections is not a likely period in which the Biden administration finally will come to the conclusion that it needs to put pressure on Israel.
Right, Trita, we see this flurry of diplomacy by Antony Blinken. Something else that we've seen recently, we see the White House, through President Biden, issue something of a warning, a threat to Israel, saying that if they don't allow aid to get through to Gaza, then there will be some consequences, unspecified consequences. We don't know what those consequences are. Does any of this have to do with the fact that Kamala Harris is actually losing support among voters in the run-up to the election, as you pointed out, less than 2 weeks away, over this issue, over Gaza?
If she wanted to turn that around, there's some clear and very simple statements that she could make in order to convince a lot of people who she has failed to convince that she's the lesser of two evils. But we're not seeing any effort from the Kamala Harris campaign to truly reach out to those voters. Rather, the investment seems to be in other demographics, and the math for that does not seem to really be able to add up. At this point, the cards are really stacked against her in terms of her likelihood of succeeding. And in terms of what you mentioned, so far we have seen the Biden administration throw out all kinds of red lines, pink lines, whatever color lines you want. And the Netanyahu government has not only not respected any of them, there's also been zero consequences for Netanyahu when he hasn't respected Biden's red lines.
Yosi Melber, great to see you. Israel, as we reported, is continuing its onslaught in Gaza. In the latest incident on Thursday, Israel bombed a school where people were taking shelter. 17 people were killed, a number of others were injured. The death toll now in Gaza is just over 43,000 people. Recently, we had Israel assassinate the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar. And the question that's being asked very often, what's the end game here? Where is this heading?
That's actually the question we all ask ourselves. What is the end game? And this is probably from day one of this war. While no one doubted the right of Israel to respond to what happened on October 7th of last year, we didn't expect that more than a year later, we'll see this kind of figures of death and devastation in Gaza. And we could have argued that after the killing of Yahya Sinwar, there was an opportunity of declaring victory. Israel set itself the objective of defeating, eliminating Hamas, bringing the hostages back, securing that Gaza won't pose a threat to it. So, in principle, it should have negotiated. And as the previous speakers said, there were opportunities before to reach a ceasefire deal and release the hostages. But now that Sinwar is dead, the same goes for some other leaders of Hamas. Also the question, who do you negotiate right now a ceasefire deal? But it's not only the lack of endgame in Gaza, there is a lack of endgame in Lebanon. It's the same playbook, plenty of military targets, but no activity in the political and diplomatic sphere to translate it into a political achievement, a political settlement, and we potentially days away from a military attack by Israel on Iran.
Yossi, there is one Israeli plan that's getting a lot of attention here in the United States. It's the so-called General's Plan. This is a plan put together by a retired Israeli general, Giora Eiland. It calls for the complete depopulation of Gaza, first in the north, then in the south, then the construction of settlements, the return of Israeli settlers to Gaza, and anyone who remains there will be considered a combatant. This is ethnic cleansing. Is this seriously considered in Israel?
Well, obviously, Giora Eiland, at least until this war, was highly respected. I think is a bit less respected, definitely, by people that don't think that that's the attitude that Israel should take. I think this kind of idea should nip in the debate by the international community, hopefully also in Israel. The last thing that Israel needs to get involved is depopulating Western, which is ethnic cleansing. There are enough suspicion of war crimes in Gaza as it is. There is a case in front of the ICJ. The ICJ already declared the occupation as unlawful. What else does Israel need in order to come to its senses that this kind of plans of resettling Gaza, depopulating Gaza, is the opposite. Also, what Israel needs, it needs to actually completely different plans to look at the day after, the reconstruction of Gaza, of enabling to rebuild Gaza, and also to look into some peace agreement in the future. And I think, yes, those kind of ideas are floated, but it's also important that the government, at least the Prime Minister Netanyahu, will come completely clean about this kind of idea and say, this is not the government's plan.
Right. Nabeel Khoury, great to see you as well. Let's look at the situation now in the north of Israel, south of Lebanon, the battle there between Israeli forces and Hezbollah. You know, the Wall Street Journal published a very detailed report on Thursday saying Hezbollah in Lebanon has suffered military setbacks, but is nowhere near defeated and is hitting back at the Israelis with considerable force. In fact, there was a Hezbollah drone that hit Prime Minister Netanyahu's house as well. So what is your assessment of what's going on in South Lebanon?
Well, I agree. Of course, it's very obvious that Hezbollah has taken a severe hit, not just in its institutions, headquarters, etc., but in the decimation of much of its leadership. However, that said, they are still pretty intact as a fighting force. They still have command and control. Their missiles are hitting deep inside Israel. More importantly, on the ground, they are causing casualties among the Israeli soldiers that are coming inside Lebanese territory. Look, much of the right-wing ministers in the Israeli government, the finance minister Smotrich, for example, was born in 1980. So the invasion of 1982, he was 2 years old. Ben-Gvir isn't much older than him. These people did not live through what was an 18-year occupation by Israel of South Lebanon. They reached Beirut, and in the end, they incurred so much in losses, in human and other losses, that they had to withdraw in the year 2000. These people are trying to recreate that myth that you can somehow go deep inside Lebanon, change the political system, install people that you could deal with or that you could manipulate. This will not be possible. But in the interim of their trying this foolish experiment, they will destroy much of Lebanon. They are hitting financial institutions, medical institutions, schools. Right. So their casualties right now are mostly, the casualties they are incurring are mostly on the civilian side. I think Lebanon will pay a very heavy price for this foolish experiment, but I think in the end, Israel will fail.
Okay, I've just got a few minutes left and I want to get back to all of you in the time we have left. Trita, Israel is threatening to strike Iran in retaliation for Iranian strikes, which in turn was retaliation for Israeli strikes on Iranian interests. Do you think there will be a strike against Iran and possibly retaliation by Iran before the American election? Because if there is a serious escalation between the two countries, it could influence the outcome of the election.
I think from Israel's standpoint, or from the Netanyahu government standpoint, there is an interest in doing this as soon as possible before the elections. Not a few days before the elections, but essentially in the next couple of days. And just in the last couple of days, several airlines have stopped all of their flights to Lebanon, to Iraq, and to Iran. And this is, of course, an indication of how they have assessed the risk situation. The Israelis have said that they have agreed to Biden administration demands not to strike nuclear facilities or economic and oil installations. But I think that is actually less relevant because the manner in which they likely will strike military targets, including trying to kill senior officials, will ensure that there will be an Iranian response.
Right.
And then there will be an Israeli response to that response. And at that point, it will likely move towards nuclear sites or oil facilities. So the first step in this escalatory cycle is not as important as the fact that we are in an escalatory cycle. And unless that is stopped entirely, we will reach the end of that cycle.
Yossi Yekelberg, the United States now has boots on the ground. They publicly said this, and the soldiers are there. They are U.S. troops operating their THAAD missile defense system. I mean, how significant is the fact that the United States now has troops inside Israel?
I think it is very significant. It changed, I think, from to a large extent the relations between Israel and the United States for a very long time, with the exception of the Gulf War of 1991, that the United States support with weapons, with intelligence, with technical advice, but doesn't put boots on the ground. The Israelis are doing the job itself. I think the situation is so severe that right now, if Israel attack Iran and there is expectation of a retaliation, there is a need also for an American intervention. And by the way, it will be probably not only boots on the ground inside Israel, it will be probably American troops elsewhere that will intercept incoming missiles and drones. So we are actually in a point of a very dangerous infliction that it can escalate and very quickly.
Okay, Nabeel Khoury, I've got less than a minute left. The Israeli goal is to create some kind of a buffer zone between Israel and Lebanon in the north. Any chance of that happening?
They will pay a heavy price if they attempt to stay in the south of Lebanon. But look, I think people should read the Israeli press and listen to the ministers and settlers, what they're saying.
Right.
Their goals are very broad-based, and they are trying to take over territory and keep it. Ministers in the government and settlers are advertising future homes in Gaza. I'm afraid the Biden administration has been very foolish, and they are being led by the nose by Netanyahu.
Right.
And when the invasion of Iran happens, or the strikes on Iran, I'm afraid the Biden administration will be right in there backing up Israel.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arland Naidu in Washington, D.C.